Good afternoon. Maybe it's good morning for you. I'm not sure. I'm Dr. Lisa McGuire, and I am the department head for the social work department. And I am delighted to make a presentation to you today. I think it'll be about 45 minutes about critical thinking and reflective writing. This is a topic that I am very passionate about, that I think is absolutely important for all social workers. And I know that this is your first social work class, maybe. And for some of you, if you've just recently transferred to JMU, it's maybe one of your first JMU classes. So very happy to have all of you and excited to talk to you a little bit about a topic that I think is absolutely critical to your social work education. So we're going to begin by talking about epistemology. That's a four-star word. When I went to my doctoral program, I figured once I figured out what we meant by epistemology, I earned my PhD. But actually, it's not all that complicated. And I really like the definition of epistemology is that it is really the science of thinking about thinking. The official definition, the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. And this is a really important thing for us to think about because people learn in different ways, and there are different kinds of learning. And in a profession like social work, where we are not just filling our heads with knowledge, but really having to begin to put that knowledge into our practice, it's very important for us to think about that. So Bloom is very famous. You hear about Bloom's taxonomy if you're doing anything in higher education, maybe even in secondary education. But he developed a taxonomy or a pyramid where at the very bottom is basic knowledge. Those are facts. You can say that lions are mammals, right? I'm not sure that's the best example, but it's the one that I came up with. So, and that kind of knowledge is at the bottom. It isn't until you can truly show your understanding of a lion as a mammal that it makes sense. So that means that mother lions give birth to baby lions and they feed them, and those are the things that mean have to do with what a mammal is like, right? So when you begin to say things like that, you show not just that you know that a lion is a mammal, but that you understand what a mammal is. And that understanding comes into play when you talk a little bit more about it. You're able to show um, additional knowledge and understanding of the idea of the lion. Then when we get into applying that knowledge, if you are on a safari and you know that a lion is a mammal and that is going to have baby lion cubs, and you know that lions are very protective, all mammals are very protective of their babies, you want to be careful when you see a female lion with a lion cub, right? So that you're beginning to apply that knowledge. And obviously, this is where I'm going to switch from lions to people and begin to understand why social workers are so interested in this Bloom's taxonomy. Because again, in our program, we're not just interested in filling your head with knowledge. We're interested in how you can take that knowledge and really apply it to be helpful to individuals, families, communities, organizations, and society as a whole. But application doesn't just, that's not the end all. Actually, there are other steps in the complexity of knowledge. And this has to do with being able to analyze and synthesize. These are words, certainly analyze is a word that you probably use regularly, maybe every day, at least every week. My guess is you say the word analysis. What does that mean? If you can just take a minute and think about analysis or analyze and jot down on your notes or on a piece of paper what you think analyze actually means. If I had you in class, I would be waiting for somebody, some brave soul, to raise their hand and tell me what analyze means. And I often get a lot of interesting answers, and eventually we usually get to the answer that I'm looking for, which analyze means to break something down into pieces. So when we analyze something, we break it down to its component parts. If you're an auto mechanic, when you analyze um, an engine, you break it down. You're going to check the different parts, the carburetor, the radiator. I should really stop talking about cars because I do not know much about them. But I do know about some things that have relevance to social work. One of the areas that I usually use as an example for this in analyzing is the idea of oppression. We often use that word all the time. If we're pressed, we might be able to come up with a definition about power and unequal power. But if we're really digging into the concept of what oppression is and what it looks like, that often gets a little bit harder for people. It's one of those things like we know it when we see it, but that's not such a good answer. One of the best ways I've thought about teaching and thinking about oppression is an article that was written quite a while ago by Dolores Norton about the 5 faces of oppression. And she wrote about 5 different ways that oppression plays out. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. It's a great article to read. Google it. It's a classic, and you can find it. But one of them is cultural imperialism. And I think that's a really interesting word. And again, this whole idea of oppression is so important to us to understand right now with facing the issues around Black Lives Matter and the rights of LGBTQI people and even gender rights. Cultural imperialism means that one culture is seen as better, imperial. One is better than all the others. Another way that when we think about racism, we might call that white supremacy, right? That we think about our white culture as being the standard by which we judge everything else. When in reality, we know that there are many other cultures, African cultures, Asian cultures, that have many incredible strengths and knowledge that should not be discounted, and we should not just judge our world based on this cultural imperialistic way of looking at white supremacy or white European culture. So that's one face of oppression. Another face of oppression is around exploitation. This is one that I like to talk about as a woman, because we know that women continue to be oppressed in our society. One way that we know that is women are still paid only about 74 cents on the dollar, I believe, for every man, which means that women's labor is exploitative. And so that exploitation, certainly slavery is the best example of exploitation around wages, and people of color still make less than a white person in terms of their dollar. And so that there is some exploitation going on in our society. So as we think about what oppression is, when I begin to talk about those examples, do you hear that that's a deeper understanding of oppression? So by using Dolores Norton's article and her model to analyze the concept of oppression, I am moving up that on that Bloom's taxonomy to truly learn something about oppression. Then, when I have analyzed something, it's important to be able to put it all back together, and that's what synthesis is. So if I am writing a paper on oppression, I'm using some definitions. I'm using Dolores Norton's article to analyze, break things down into her 5 faces of oppression, giving some clear examples of application. Then at the end of my essay, I'm probably going to want to pull it all together, and that's going to show that I have a grasp of knowledge. Then I may go back and want to evaluate that. Is there any research that evaluates some of the impacts of Dolores Norton's article? Could I suggest some ways to evaluate that model? Are there things that other authors have come up that critique that model? All of that has to do with evaluation. And so that's seen at the top part of the pyramid. So you can see we've gone to a basic fact down here and moved all the way up that Bloom's taxonomy. Again, this way of thinking about knowledge has been around since the late 1950s. It was truly transformative at the time. Now we sort of take it for granted, but you'll still see Bloom quoted. And they did do some changes on the levels and things that I actually think are interesting, but I just wanted to present the basic model today. So, what does this have to do with critical thinking? Well, let's begin to think about what critical thinking is. Basham, Irwin, Nardone, and Wallace in a nice article talk about critical thinking is disciplined thinking governed by clear intellectual standards. We're going to talk about what those clear intellectual standards are in a couple minutes, and I'm going to ask you to begin to utilize those in looking at your own thinking. Because Paul and Elder, a couple of my favorite authors on critical thinking, have talked about critical thinking being self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrected thinking. It's all about you. It's all about you and your thinking process. At JMU, we do require a critical thinking class. They probably used some different models than Paul and Elder. So this is going to be sort of hopefully a build on that. If you haven't already taken your critical thinking class, if you're a transfer to JMU, you may be taking it this semester. So you might be looking at some different models, but this is the model that I'm going to present to you today with the clear intellectual standards. So let's dig deeper. Critical thinking is also purposeful. We do this thinking about different topics for a reason. And again, in social work, this is going to be very important to us. It's guided by those intellectual standards that we're going to learn about. It supports the development of intellectual traits such as humility. Humility is really important because it allows us not only to own what we know, but to think about what we do not know. And that is really important in this day and age with so much information flying around. And again, I've got my bachelor's degree, I got my master's degree, I got my PhD. That does not mean I know everything. And I still have to use my own humility as part of my critical thinking to continue to learn and grow and respond to knowledge. The next word should sound familiar to you, integrity. Why should this word sound familiar? Hopefully you've already looked at the NASW Code of Ethics and realized that this is one of the core values of our profession. Perseverance, empathy, and self-discipline. The intellectual standards that define critical thinking help us to do all of those things. And again, I think there's a good amount of overlap between what we are trying to do as a social worker, our social work values, and critical thinking. It also identifies some basic elements of thought. That we're not going to talk about that so much today, but if you look at Paul and Elder's stuff in terms of how to write a research paper and things, there's some real good stuff there. So, critical thinking is self-assessing and self-improving. We've talked about that, part of lifelong learning. It's both holistic and analytic at the same time. We deal with people who are complex, right? Individuals, peoples, families, groups, communities, all of those things are unique. And so we need to be able to look at the big picture as well as to be able to break things down into and do that analysis. And we need to be able to be flexible in moving back and forth between those perspectives. That's good critical thinking. We need to be creating well-reasoned answers. That's good for you as a student in this class and other classes. You need to be creating well-reasoned responses when you talk with clients. You may be asked questions by judges. You may be asked questions by your supervisor. So all of these critical thinking skills, you're going to need to be able to use in your practice all the time. You also need to be responsive to arguments, and not like getting in fights and stuff, but debates, both with yourself as well as with others, to seek and identify the weaknesses or the gaps in your thoughts, as well as to own the knowledge that you do have. In social work, there are so many times where there is not one right answer, but you need to be able to think and realize that someone else may have a better answer, and how to come up with the best answer that's going to do the best for your client, whether that's an individual, family, group, community, organization, or all of society. So it is part of our professional responsibility. So, analyzing critical thinking. So how do we break critical thinking down into some pieces? Well, Paul and Elder have done this through the Universal Intellectual Standards. Here is the link to their website. They have all kinds of materials on there about critical thinking. One of my favorites is this it's called the Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking. It's maybe $4 or $5, I think, although I think you can even print out the whole thing free now. But it is great to have, and I actually have one in my desk right now. So to think critically entails having command of these standards. Students must become skilled at using these standards to both guide and to challenge their own thinking. And your professors are going to also challenge you around critical thinking. So what are those standards? So there are 8 critical thinking standards, and these are the 4 basic ones. If you haven't done a lot of work with critical thinking before, this is a great place to start. I often say you got to walk before you can run. So these are the very basics. And when I talk about these things, I'm actually talking about your thinking, but often the physical manifestation of your thinking is in your writing, right? So what I would challenge you to do is when you write your reflection paper for this class, that you write it maybe 24 hours later, put it down, come back to it, and then look for all of these first 4 critical thinking standards. Can you see an example of clarity, accuracy, precision, and relevance? How will you know? Well, you've got these little nice questions, again, breaking it down into specific kinds of ways to look at it. Because again, we all know kind of what clarity means, right? Making something clear. But as you're thinking about it in your own thinking and writing, could you elaborate further on that point? Could you express that point in another way? Can you say it in a little bit different way? Or could you give me an illustration or an example? Often clarity, you can say something where empowerment is important to social work practice. Well, yeah, but that's not a very clear statement. So if you can take that, empowerment is important to social work practice, for example, and then whatever it is that you're writing about, give that example. You just went from a C response to an A response, right there in front of our eyes by using that clarity. Because when you say empowerment is important in social work, I have no idea if you understand what empowerment really is. But when you give that example that often includes some kind of application of empowerment, you have gone up 2 steps on the Bloom's taxonomy scale, and you've really demonstrated this intellectual standard. The second one is accuracy. This is something that's very important in this day and age. All of us are probably on Facebook, many of you tweets, Twitters, um, and there's a lot of misinformation and sometimes just downright lies flying around out there. So it really behooves all of us to make sure that what we are saying and what we are thinking is accurate. So is that really true? How could we check that? How could we find out if that is true? If you're making factual statements, you want to make sure that you're backing them up with some information. In a lot of my classes, I talk a lot about poverty, and sometimes not just with social work students. So I get statements like, if people would get a job, that would take care of poverty. Well, that's actually an inaccurate statement because at least 60, I haven't looked at the statistics recently, especially with COVID, but in the past, about 60% of poor people work, that are people that are under the level of poverty. The problem is we don't have a living wage that will allow them to be above the poverty level. And often they're only able to get part-time jobs because employers don't want to provide benefits, so they keep them at the part-time level. So there is some accuracy issues that we want to make sure when we are making these statements like that we have information that backs them up. And with you having your devices, your phone, your computer at your fingertips, there's really no excuse for not looking up. So if you see statements that you're making that could be checked for accuracy, go ahead and Google it. Find a good source and cite that website, or sometimes you can even get formal academic articles. Precision. This is important for beginning social workers because you're beginning to use the language of social work. So you could write in a paper that it's important to view a client's family and their school and their neighborhood, their community, their culture, their state, and their nation when we analyze their situation. Or you could say it's important to use the ecological perspective. So you just saved a whole lot of words and you were a whole lot more precise by using the language of the profession. And you're going to want to start thinking about that and trying to do that as you become a social worker. So the precision of your language is really important. We always want to be trying to be concise and succinct in our writing without sacrificing depth and breadth and some other things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Then the fourth one is relevance, and this is one that sometimes it's kind of a duh. It's like, well, of course you should be writing something that's relevant to what we're speaking of. It's really only very apparent when it's not there. So we do want to think about, are we choosing the relevant topic? How is that, is what I'm choosing to discuss connected to the question at hand? How does it bear on the issue? Is this the most important issue among all I might have chosen to think about? So if you can do those four things in your writing, you are on a very good path. But there's more. These are the more advanced critical thinking skills. We have depth, breadth, logic, and fairness. Depth begins to look at the complexities of an issue. This is again where in a paper on oppression, you can talk very generally about oppression, but if you start breaking it down using the 5 faces of oppression and truly analyzing an issue, that's showing depth. And that is a really good way to add breadth to your work, is to break something down, to use your analyses. How does your answer address the complexities of the question? How are you taking into account the problems in the question? Are you dealing with the most significant factors? All of those things and the analysis that I talked about will really add depth to your work. Then we think about breadth. If depth is the deep part, breadth is the wide part. And it is always important for us in a profession that often has some value-based stances to really be thinking about what are the other points of view. Some of those points of view may differ from ours. They may differ from our professional organization's point of views, but it's important to take those into consideration and analyze those as well. Is there another way to look at this issue? What would this look like from a conservative viewpoint? What would this look like from a progressive viewpoint? What would this look like from the point of view of someone else? Again, this is a really good one to think about race and racism right now. As a white woman, my perspective is going to be very different from a person of color. And how do I take into account those differences? And how can I begin to learn from them? And to be open to seeing the world from multiple perspectives. Really important. Logic. Does this really make sense? Does it follow from what you said? How does it follow? Often I see this in reflection papers. I'm going to talk about a model that you begin by talking about one thing, but then you later end up talking about something totally different. That's not showing logic. So sometimes people get on tangents, it happens. But when you're writing, you want to make sure that where you start and then how you follow through to where you finish are consistent, logically consistent. And the last is fairness. We know that people do have vested interests in different issues and challenges and problems. And we need to make sure that we're being fair in our portrayal of some of those other ways of looking at things. So these are the 4 more advanced critical thinking skills, but all of them are important. And I would guarantee that if you can begin to analyze your writing, any paper, any class, and use these, look for these critical thinking standards in your writing, and identify the places where you've done a great job with them, and identify the places where there's a gap. That's going to really improve your writing. Okay, so how do we learn to do this? How do we learn to do critical thinking? It's like an old joke that maybe you've heard or maybe you haven't. A man's walking down the street in New York in Times Square and says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And someone looks at him and says, "Practice, practice, practice." So yeah, this is not something that just happens, that you're born with. Some of you may have had great teachers in high school, in community college, in previous university classes that have really helped you to think critically. Some of you may not, but this is something that you can learn to do. And frankly, if it were easy, anybody would do it. And I can say, being on Facebook, probably way too much, there's a lot of people who are just not quite getting the critical thinking piece. So why is it so hard? What are the barriers to our critical thinking? Because they certainly exist, and it's important to identify those if we're going to move beyond. Inconsistency in our thinking, bias, narrow-mindedness, wishful thinking, closed-mindedness, resistance to change. All of those things are barriers to critical thinking. They are also very much part of being human. We know that human nature leans toward these things. And so that's why it's so important to be very explicit in how we think about critical thinking and then begin to try to address some of these barriers. So these are the 4 main ones that Basham, that I already cited from them, talked about. So we have egocentrism. It is very natural and very human that we see the world through our own perspective. In some ways, how could we not? Um, our thinking, though, often is self-interested and self-serving because that's who we are as a person. We have to take care of ourselves, right? At the same time, that can be a barrier to our critical thinking. And if we're not aware of it and think about what is my self-interest in this situation, what biases am I bringing, it means that we are failing in critical thinking. Then on the other hand, we have sociocentrism. This is we are socialized. You see that socialized. We are socialized in families, in churches, in neighborhoods, in communities, in cities, in nations, um, to think about things in a certain way. And that means that we have these group biases. Again, they are implicit, they are buried deep within us so that they become part of automatic thinking. We're not even able to identify what those things are. Unwarranted assumptions. We grow up, we have experiences, we develop stereotypes. Some of them are from that ego and sociocentrism, but some of them are a little bit different. One of the things, if you've never done it, to take the Harvard implicit bias test, you can Google it, it's very easy to find. It is very hard to have been raised in the United States of America and not have racist thoughts. And the problem is not to have them, but it's not being aware that those biases are within us and that we have examined them to help understand where they came from, and that we have a sincere desire to change and work towards social, economic, and environmental justice. So take the Harvard implicit bias test. See where you fall. It's very interesting. Even sometimes people of color have fallen prey to those biases. So it's very important. And that's part of the responsibility that we have to examine our thinking so that we are not reacting based on unexamined thinking, but that we're using critical thinking. And the last one is one that I think social workers are frankly susceptible to. We want the world to be better, right? That's what we're striving for. That's what our professional and our personal missions have to do with. And I will use an example that's relevant to Black Lives Matters and a lot of other things that are going on in our society right now. I was never naive to think that racism didn't exist, but I must say that I have been taken aback, disgusted, overwhelmed, demoralized by the extent of that racism in our nation that we have gone for many years without looking at, with having that be implicit in much of our society. I'm thankful that those issues are coming out into the forefront. We have so much work to do. And I must say that some of my African American friends and colleagues said that that was the case. They always felt like there was much more racism than most people knew. I'm not sure. It's not that I didn't believe them, but I think I was still looking through my own lenses, and there were lots of things that I wasn't seeing. And I'm thankful that I'm seeing that. It's a rough time for our country, and there's a lot of work to do. So I do not want to let my own sense of wanting things to be better to be a barrier to critical thinking. And I think sometimes for me in the past, that has been the case. I hope not so much right this minute. So why does critical thinking matter to social workers? It allows us to avoid errors, misclassifying, carrying on interventions too long, focusing on irrelevant factors or weak interventions, We have been accused of increasing client dependency, and I think that that can be true. We've missed using strengths that clients bring to the table, taking behavior out of its context. All those kinds of things are critical thinking errors. Critical thinking also encourages us, pushes us, demands us to utilize best practices and evidence as we are moving forward in what we do with clients. And it also allows us to look at new best practices and when new things come online to be able to make good decisions so that we can provide the very best that we can for our clients, which is what they deserve. So I'm going to spend just a little bit more time talking about reflective writing and critical thinking. As I said before, your critical thinking is made manifest in your writing. And I'm going to describe to you a model of reflective writing that's called the DEAL model that I believe Professor Hunter is asking you to use for an assignment. I want to talk just a minute before I do about that reflection. The reflective process is very important to social work practice because, again, we are an applied profession. We are actually not just teaching you knowledge in your head, but asking you to take that knowledge, reflect on it, apply it with clients, then look what happens, think, should I keep doing that? Should I do something different? Having that reflection process and then continuing to practice. It's called the experiential learning loop by Kolb, and it absolutely involves reflection at multiple steps along the way. And I believe that this is the best way for you to learn to think about social work practice and then to be able to apply it as you go into the field. So in this model of structured reflection, we also want you to be thinking about those intellectual standards of critical thinking. So what does the DEAL model? How do you do this? So the first section is D for describe, and you describe some kind of experience. In the past, sometimes Professor Hunter's had you use this for your service learning experience. Sometimes she's had you do it based on your cultural humility exercise. I don't know what she's doing it this time, but you can use the DEAL model for any experience. Reading an article can be an experience. Watching a video can be an experience. All kinds of different things. But you're going to take that experience and describe it. The who, what, when, where. And this is often the shortest part of a DEAL reflection. We don't want you to spend a whole lot of time. We want you to just get the basics using that concise summary. So the describe section of a DEAL model reflection is usually only about one paragraph. That gets the basics down. Then the examine, E, in the DEAL model. This is where you're going to link that event or experience that you just described to the academic content of this course of 287. What are some of the concepts, theories, issues that you have discussed so far? What have you read about in your textbook? I've mentioned a couple of them that we've already talked about. I've mentioned the ecological perspective, right? Or person and environment. I've mentioned empowerment. I've mentioned oppression. I've mentioned the strengths perspective. So, and there are all kinds of other ones. So as you think about your event experience, what are some of those relevant, did you hear that? That's one of the critical thinking standards, theories, concepts, issues from the 287 class. And what I would like you to do is when you write this reflection, I would like you to do a formal APA citation of that concept. you can quote that or cite that from your textbook or another outside reading. For example, I do talk a lot about the strengths perspective in my writing, and I always, after I say strengths perspective, in parentheses, Salibi 2001, because when I talk about the strengths perspective, I'm talking about the original writing in a textbook that Dennis Salibi talked about the five the five basic principles of the strengths perspective. The first one is all clients and communities have strengths. And then there are others that go on. So I'm being very specific about that. If I'm going to talk about the strengths perspective, I need to have a source, a document, and I need to begin to cite those sources because that's an important part of accuracy in social work. So I'm going to talk about that event in light of this concept. This part of a deal reflection is usually 2, 3, maybe 4 paragraphs. You're going to do as much, and this is where hopefully you're showing your clarity, your accuracy, your relevance, your precision of language, your depth, your breadth, your logic, because what you talked about in your event should link to the examine section, and it should link to the last section that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So this is where you're really allowed to demonstrate all those intellectual standards that demonstrate critical thinking in that examine section. And then the last section is where you are going to talk about your learning. This is the Articulate Learning AL section. 4 paragraphs. When I ask students to use the deal model, I like them to use them as subtitles. What did I learn? Blah, 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 blah. So you're usually going to write 2 or 3 sentences. That's usually pretty good. It's pretty easy for you to see that. How did I learn it is a little bit harder, but people have different ways of learning it. You may have that light bulb go on right when you're in the middle of practice. It may be when you sit back and think about it, reflect on it. So you need to think about your own learning process. How does this learning happen for you? And then the third and fourth question relate to you as a social worker. Number 3, why is this learning important for me as a social worker? Or if you're not planning to go into social work, some other profession, but I think you're all in an intro to social work class. So why is this learning important for social workers? And then number 4, what will I do with this learning in my future career? I'm going to ask you to try to be as specific as you can. This is a place where you can think about. You may be interested, for example, in school social work, or you may be interested in working in a hospital, or you may be interested in doing clinical mental health work. So be specific here. I am not going to hunt you down and see if that's what you end up doing. You may end up doing something absolutely different, but for the purpose of this paper, I would like you to think about a potential future kind of practice so you can answer the question, what will I do with this learning in my future career? And then you're done. So that is the deal model in a nutshell. That's the basic understanding of critical thinking and why it's important to your social work practice and how you need to begin to be implementing it in all of your writing for the social work department, along with things like basic grammar, logical consistency, using professional language, which are all the critical thinking skills we already talked about. I will say that if writing is not your strong suit, I strongly encourage you to use the resource of the Writing Center. They have been very helpful to students. We don't take off on your papers, but you will need to have well-developed writing skills as you move through the classes in the department, as well as into your future career. So it is very worth your time and energy right now to work on those writing skills. And if you can use the Writing Center, by all means, please do it. So that is what I got. I'm almost exactly on 45 minutes. Here are some of my sources. So if you want to look up other information, you can certainly do that. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to share one of my passions, and I hope you have an excellent year in the social work program. Thank you.